Okay, today is day 65 of What's in the Bible or Bible in 90 Days, where we're reading through the entire Bible in 90 days to get an overview, a full picture, a narrative of what the entire story of the Bible is, so that we don't get bogged down in maybe only the places that we like or the stories that we gravitate to or the ones that we feel are best to be shared, but we're just looking at the entire Bible just to see, what it says. So at the moment, we're in the prophets. Today, we're entering the book of Daniel, who was another prophet as well. He was a Jew, an Israelite that was a prophet during the time that the Israelites were in Babylon. So around the time of King Nebuchadnezzar. So we're gonna get to hear about his story today. It's an awesome book, and I think it gives some hope to the youth because Daniel and his companions were very young guys when they were taken to Babylon. But still, God was very active in their lives and, He used them for great things. So, that's always awesome to see that God can work through any kind of people or any kind of, age range. So, day 65, Daniel chapter 1. To chapter 8. Daniel 1, we hear about the besieging of Jerusalem by the king of Babylon, the taking of the treasures of the temple to Babylon. We already know about this because we saw this in Jeremiah and other prophets that we've read. So young men from the royal family and nobles were taken to be taught the literature and language of the Chaldeans. In Babylon, they would be taught this for 3 years. So Daniel was one of them, together with another guy called Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. They were also given other names. Daniel was given Belshazzar. Hananiah was given Shadrach, Mishael, Meshach, Azariah, Abednego. So those were like Babylonian names according to their gods or whatever. So they were obviously in the care of the king, and they were being given food and provision, and as they're being taught, all this stuff about Babylon. Daniel refuses to eat the delicacies of the king so as not to defile himself and asks for vegetables and water. So he asked for a strict diet of vegetables and water. They were tested for 10 days and they were actually found to be healthier because, the guard of the palace did not want to give them stuff that was going to make them look feeble, because as far as the king was concerned, that would not be the right thing to do. So he also says that the four young men were given wisdom from God, and Nebuchadnezzar calls them after the time, and they were found to be, the best. Daniel served, it says here, until the time of Cyrus. So from Nebuchadnezzar capturing Jerusalem all the way to Cyrus making the pronouncement that the Jews could go back to rebuild the temple, Daniel was serving, all these times. So Daniel chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream and demands the interpretation as well as the dream. This is different now from maybe what happened, if you remember, with Pharaoh, where he said what the dream was, but people couldn't interpret it. But Nebuchadnezzar now was saying, I want you to tell me what I dreamt, and I want you to tell me the interpretation. So that was a real steep challenge, for anybody to be able to say, this is what you dreamt, although they were not in the dream. So no magician or wise person, of course, in the whole kingdom could to tell him the dream as well as interpret it. The king orders the wise men to be killed since they couldn't interpret and tell him the dream. Daniel hears of this, obviously because all the wise men and the magicians are about to be killed, and he prays with Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, and the dream as well as the interpretation is shown to Daniel. So Daniel is brought before the king and tells him the dream as well as the interpretation. So it was about a statue which had a head of gold, chest and arms of silver, middle section and the thighs were of bronze, the legs were of iron, and the feet were partly iron and partly clay. Then a stone was cut out of somewhere and came and hit the statue at the feet, and obviously it's all scattered and everything else, so nobody knew what that meant. And Daniel, obviously with wisdom from God, was able to tell the king what that meant. So the meaning was about his kingdom and the kingdoms that were to come, and that the final kingdom would be a kingdom that God himself would bring into the world, and that was the one that would destroy the remaining kingdom. Daniel obviously gives all the credit to God, to say that he was not some super guy or whatever for him to know the dream as well as interpret it, but that it was God who had revealed it to him. So as a result of this, Daniel is made a ruler of the province of Babylon and chief of all the wise men. Hananiah and the rest of the friends are also promoted at Daniel's request. Chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar makes a statue and orders everybody to worship it. So this is some time afterwards. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, they were brought before the king because they disobeyed this command that, we're not going to worship, your statue, whatever. So they were brought before the king and they were given one more chance, to worship. And in verse 16 and 17 is actually what I like to say an epic, response that Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah actually said in response to the king, because the king said, hey, if you do not worship this idol, you're going to be killed. So let's have a look. Just take a quick break and see what it says. So Daniel chapter 3 verse 16 and 17. So it said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we need not to present a defense to you in this matter. If our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire and out of your hand, O king, let him deliver us. Verse 18. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods and we will not worship the golden statue that you have set up. So I like that response, that they were ready to stand for their beliefs and not worship this image that Nebuchadnezzar put in place. So Nebuchadnezzar is very angry at this and orders that these three guys, be thrown into the furnace so that they could die. But as they were thrown in there, Nebuchadnezzar actually sees four men instead, and these guys were not harmed by this fire, and they were taken out. They were not burnt at all. There wasn't even a smell of fire after they had been thrown into this furnace. Nebuchadnezzar is impressed, and obviously promotes these three, and blasphemy against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is actually made into a capital crime, because Nebuchadnezzar is that impressed that there was a God that could deliver them. So if there was a God like that could deliver them from something like that, then that God should not be messed around with. So it's a really interesting turn of events. Daniel chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar praises and worships God and recounts another dream that Daniel interpreted for him about a large tree that signified his kingdom and how it was cut down. Nebuchadnezzar was humbled when he was proud, and he was made to eat grass like an animal. So this was the interpretation of the dream and what ended up happening. So when the time was right, his senses were restored to him, and the kingdom was restored as well. And Nebuchadnezzar attests to the sovereignty of God, his eternal nature, everlasting kingdom, all powerful and most wise. Daniel chapter 5, Belshazzar was the son of Nebuchadnezzar. So time has moved on. So because the book of Daniel covers a real long period of time, so the son of Nebuchadnezzar, whose name was Belshazzar, he had a feast, like a party for all his top guys or whatever. And he took the vessels of the temple, the ones that were taken from Jerusalem to Babylon, and starts to drink wine in them, and they start worshiping their gods, the gods of silver, gods of bronze, gods of the gods of silver, etc. And a sign appears amongst their party, that a hand just showed up out of nowhere, just a hand on its own, and started writing some things on the wall. So, and everybody in the party is obviously afraid. Nobody's able to interpret the writing until Daniel again was called to interpret what this writing meant. Daniel tells Belshazzar that he should have known better given his father's reign, and things like how he was humbled, and how God had worked in Nebuchadnezzar's life. So if anything, the son should have known better. The writing meant that his kingdom was to be brought to an end. His actions had been found wanting, and the kingdom would be divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. We also hear that Belshazzar dies that night. Then Darius, the Mede, received the kingdom. So you can get to see now how it goes from Israel being captured by Babylon, then Babylon, being taken over by the Medes and the Persians. Daniel chapter 6, Darius promotes Daniel after he had distinguished himself. Daniel was about to be promoted again, and the other governors obviously conspired against him. The only way that they could find fault with Daniel would be with the worship of his God, because he was a blameless guy. He was trying to do everything according to the way that the king wanted, but when it came to his faith, or how he believed in God, they found that that's the only way that they could find, fortune. So the conspiracy, they made a rule that nobody was allowed to pray to anybody but Darius. Otherwise that they would be thrown into a den of lions. Daniel hears about it but pays no regard to it, and he continued to worship, to worship God and to pray to God. And he was brought before the king, obviously because he had disobeyed their order. Although Darius didn't want to, Daniel was thrown into the den of lions because he had made this decree, not knowing that these people were conspiring, to kill Daniel. So Daniel is unharmed. The lions do not eat him. Darius, we hear that, prayed and fasted for him during the night, and Daniel was taken out the following day, and the conspirators, were thrown into the den instead, and they were eaten by the lions. Darius then goes on to to praise God. In Daniel chapter 7, it then does a little bit of a rewind that in the first year of Belshazzar, Daniel had a dream about 4 beasts and the coming of the final judgment, the transfer of power to another. And Daniel was given the interpretation that this was about the kings and the kingdoms, that were to come, that the peculiar beast that he had seen was for the very end, and all the things that it would do, before the final judgment came. Daniel 8, we hear about another vision that Daniel saw, which was of a ram and a goat and other horns that came out of the goat. And this vision was about the end. And obviously the interpretation that Daniel is given was that this was about the kings of Media and Persia that were coming to destroy, Babylon. The goat was Greece and its kings and kingdoms that would follow, after that. But we get a bit of an insight there that it says Daniel didn't even understand, what these visions meant, either. So as much as they were saying all these things and being, told and being shown dreams and visions, that does not necessarily mean that they understood exactly what was going on. God was speaking through him, for his purposes. So Daniel is an awesome book. It has some really interesting stories. If you get a chance, do pick it up and see, the kind of stuff that he talks about. I'll see you tomorrow as we continue in the book of Daniel. We'll finish Daniel tomorrow, and we'll also get into a new prophet, called Hosea. See you tomorrow.